very pleased to have this opportunity to share with you some of the details and insights that I've come across with regard to the design and stringing of a standard 1/3 scale marionette. The marionette body, which I have here before me, is a 1/3 scale adult male figure in the abstract. I've made him of ordinary dowel sticks and construction-grade lumber and broomsticks, broom handles and mop handles and that sort of thing. But he is what I would call a test bed. I can demonstrate on him the various joints which form the anatomy of the marionette. And my effort here is to create a marionette who has approximately the same capacity for movement as a human being. I'll begin with the hand of this marionette, showing you the wrist joint, which is nothing more than a cord, a sash cord, a common sash cord attaching the hand to the lower arm. Notice that the lower arm is a shallow cone. There's a slightly pointed center to it through which I've drilled a hole and inserted a sash cord. The other end of the sash cord is inserted into the hand itself, and the hand then can swing left and right, up toward the thumb or down, and in each position it comes to a stop, which is meant to approximate the stops which are involved in a normal human hand movement. That general principle is one that I've applied throughout the jointing of this marionette. That is, that it should represent approximately the same kinds of limitations which pertain to a regular human joint. Now, this elbow joint is a 2-cord joint, and it has 2 stops, one in the closed position, one in the open position. The stops, incidentally, are just the 2 faces that come together to stop the action in that direction or in the opposite direction. That same joint is repeated elsewhere in the marionette, and we'll get to it in order. I find that the most fascinating joint and most difficult one to do adequately is the shoulder joint. You can see here, probably, that I have left the shoulder quite loose. That is, I've not allowed the arm to be fetched up tightly against the chest. Instead, I've given 5/8 of an inch, maybe some marionettes I would give more slack than that. The sash cord is exposed between the body and the upper arm so that the marionette has the capacity to shrug. That is, by raising his arm above his chest, he is allowed to shrug. The suspension of the upper arm in a human being, or of the front leg in most mammals, in all mammals, is a very tricky deal. The ball and socket are on a floating platform of bone, which runs across the back and is heavily muscled, and of the clavicle, which comes to the front, so that ball and socket does not remain in one place and pivot in a static way like this. Instead, the whole ball and socket float. And that is, I think, a very important thing to remember. That slackness allows the marionette's arm to be drawn across his chest as well, which is a flexibility that counts for something when you're specially stringing. He can reach to the back or to the front, given the freedom of that joint. The next joint I want to show you is really a compound joint in this marionette. I've allowed him to have the flexibility of a joint at the base of his neck and one at the top of the neck, just under the skull position. Now, I find that this kind of flexibility allows him to tilt his head in a kind of coy way, or to hang his head very deeply, or to raise up and look up in the air and turn his head from side to side. This is a single cord anchored in the chest, running through a bead or a spool, which is specially shaped, and anchored permanently in the head. The next joint I'll show you is the waist. It, too, is a single cord joint, basically, and the single cord, of course, is located centrally. And it would be appropriate to note that it represents the spine, the freedom of movement of the spine at that level, at the belt level of the figure. And I have the torso and the hip connected so that they can twist within a limited range, or turning from side to side, or revolve on a vertical axis. The limiting rope here is anchored in the hip, runs up through a hollow channel in the upper body, and is anchored in the opposite hip, so that it has the freedom to slide through the upper body, as you can see here, and it will at the same time prevent the torso from twisting too extremely on the vertical axis. The upper leg, jointed here by 2 sash cords, has 2 stops up against the face of the hip and of the face of the leg on the front, and at the face of the hip and leg at the rear. And I've taken care again to make sure that that freedom of movement resembles what is normal for an ordinary life-size human being. I did mention that the elbow joint was similar to the knee, and you can see probably that it has a stop at the rear here and a stop at the front. Now, this is not a complex marionette. Most marionettes in professional work will probably have a ball and socket joint, but the same limitations will apply. And if you're beginning in your career as a marionette artist, don't be discouraged by the simplicity of this. The movement is a basic, in my view, perhaps the most important characteristic of any character is its ability to move in keeping with the personality and the events that make up the story. The last joint I have to show you is the foot. It is anchored, of course, at the lower end of the lower leg. It is a 2-string joint, or 2-chord joint, and I've given it about 30 degrees up at the front and 30 degrees down at the front, so possibly a total of 60 degrees total latitude. I like to note that my own feet splay a little bit. That is, my toes point out slightly if I notice my footprints in the snow. And I try to make my marionettes conform to that general pattern. You can see here that the toes do not touch each other while the heels do in a standing position. So I've turned the toes out, each foot about 15 degrees for a total of perhaps 30 degrees. I've just made that angle at the ankle. I've not turned the knee or the hip. I've just turned the foot on the lower end of the lower leg to accomplish that. When the marionette is walking, it is a very convenient fact that the toes do not easily tangle with one another. I want to show you something about the stringing of the leg, which I have not mentioned before, and that is, this is a device which my father, Rufus Rose, invented or created. To my knowledge and to the knowledge of my mother, Margot Rose, this is the only origin she knows for this particular stringing is the fact that my father invented it. Now here we have a string for the leg running down through the upper knee, coming out through the rear of the knee, running into the back of the calf, out through the top of the ankle, just above the ankle, and into the top of the foot. What happens here is that when that string is pulled, not only does the knee rise, as would be normal, and here I'm just raising the knee, and most puppeteers are probably aware of this kind of stringing, where you have a dead tie of a string to the knee and simply lift the foot. What this figure does instead is to lift not only the knee, but also to lift the toe. As you can see, the toe rises off the table here with the knee, and what this allows is for the marionette to walk without stumbling. The toe does not drag on the rug or on the setting that you may have on your marionette stage, and gives you a free opportunity to step over things. Now, I'd like to show you a series of close-up shots, which are going to be a little difficult, and I'll try to make them all relatively convenient by staying in one place and talking about them one after another. I'm going to put my marionette down in front here and tell you, first of all, that Albrecht Roser, who is a very great marionette artist, whose home is both in this country and in Stuttgart, Germany, passed on to me and to a number of other puppeteers at a national convention a few years ago his notion of suspension of hands and heads. It's a 3-point suspension in which I have in my right hand now the right hand control for my marionette, this Rodney marionette, as I call him. His name is Rodney McDowell because I've used so many dowel sticks in his construction. Here I have, and I'm pointing to it, suspended his thumb string. There's a control string at the end of my right index finger which runs down to his thumb. There is at the end of my pinky finger here in my right hand a string which runs straight down to his pinky position, and I'm alternating those two now. I'm raising his thumb, now his pinky. and you can see the response in his hand. I have that kind of control with this. Albrecht suggests that we add a third string at the rear, and now I'm going to lift it. At the rear of this control, I'm lifting the wrist string. And I can raise the two finger strings or the wrist string, and you can see that the marionette is waving. Now, I've added to that. I thought that was very clever, and I naturally wanted to interpret it as best I could, that technical invention. And what I've done is to add an elbow string at the rear of my hand control up here, and my pinky is now pulling on it, is an elbow string. So that by putting my own pinky between the wrist string here and the elbow string, I'm able to distinguish separately the movement from the wrist to the elbow and or rotate his hand. Now I'm using this hand rotation based on Albrecht Roser's three-point suspension principle. He also applies the same principle to the suspension of the head. And it should be noted that the head strings carry only the weight of the head. They do not support any of the weight of the body. The shoulder strings do that, and I'll get to that a little later. But on this marionette, the nose string rises to the front and center of the control where my finger is pointing. The two ear strings respectively go to the left and right extremities of the second wing, if I may call it that, on the controller. And when I tip the controller up, the consequence is that his nose is raised. When I tip the controller to the right, the consequence is that I've raised his left ear, and his nose and his right ear are not lifted. So he turns slightly to the left. If I simply tip the controller to the right, he looks to the left, and vice versa. Now, by grasping the control in such a way that I can lift his shoulder strings at the same time that I'm lifting his left ear, I can make his movement rather extreme. His head tilts slightly forward because I'm lifting his body weight with the shoulder strings, and he can then turn rather a lot. And that's what I would call the three-point suspension system for hands and heads. There is a special control, which I like to have on most of my marionettes, and I call it a special. I've inserted a little nail or a little hook. Sometimes I use a bit of toothpick embedded in this end, the thumb end of the hand control. With that little hook, I reach into this position on the controller. One of these two strings will lift the left hand, one will lift the right hand of the marionette. And I'll hook the first one and pull it out to the side, and as you can see, I've taken hold of a string with that hook, which runs down through the head of the marionette, out through his mouth, and is anchored in his right hand, so that when I pull that string with a hook here, I'm drawing that special string, and his right hand goes to his mouth. The other special string, which is about an inch behind it on the controller, and I'm now pulling it, controls a left hand in a very similar gesture. Now, I can, if I wish, pick up both of those strings and pluck them at the same time, giving him a fairly complicated gesture. Now, these special strings need not be hand to mouth, although probably puppeteers are inclined to think of themselves as hand-to-mouth creatures. Here I'm demonstrating a walking movement. Notice that the cradle in which I've rested my thumb here is soldered to an axle which runs forward on the controller to the foot bar. The right knee or leg string is attached here on the extreme end of the foot bar, the left one on the opposite end. As I rotate the axle, the marionette's feet are made to move in place here. And of course his toes are being lifted, as I suggested earlier. They would be by that special stringing. There he goes. Now, I want to say something about the continuous stringing in the hands. This hand control, as you can see me drawing it out to the side, is attached to its opposite partner over here on the left. The front string and the rear string pass through two screw eyes in either end of the two wings and drop down to the other hand control. If I take the left hand control and pull it out, I've lifted the right hand control and have an accompanying result down in the marionette. They are continuous. And in fact, I can give this left hand a rather complex movement just by fishtailing, what I call fishtailing the right hand control. and it gives him a wonderful flexibility, in my opinion. I call this control design the Pepito marionette control because it is one I have devised in support of a character that I've designed and which I would like to show you. I'm going to put him away. Something I'd like to say about characterization, I've mentioned earlier on in the program. In my view, a marionette or a hand puppet or a shadow puppet or a piece of music or a piece of sculpture must speak to something which is real for us as human beings. For us to deal with puppetry or any other art or craft form only on its superficial basis, it seems to me, is to give it unnecessary limits. My intention, usually, when I design a marionette, is to give just due to the reality of some human characteristics. And this marionette I'm about to show you is called Pepito. And I will tell you a little bit about his character as I present him to you. I conceived of Pepito as a marionette who perhaps was a young boy in Italy, perhaps in the 13th or 14th century, maybe the 15th century possibly. And I'm using in Pepito here exactly the same elements of the control as I have already shown you. But I'm presenting him now as a character, as I describe him in my monologue here. I'm trying to present him as I would to an audience. He is relatively shy. He is not red, white, and blue, green, yellow, and pink. I've dressed him in a very down kind of color, an off-white ruff at his neck, off-white cuffs, and a brown costume. And his makeup or face colors are rather simple, dun colors. I've given him a little color in his feet, which have a little pointy toes. And he can put the back of his left hand up to his cheek in silence to look at you. He raise his right hand, either put a finger up beside of his nose or raise it even higher and look under his hand, maybe at you. He's got his thumb in his eye right now. And when I take both of these strings together, as I said I could, he could step out and maybe he'll peek under his arm at a small child who's approaching. I've tried to make Pepito a character who will be friendly, curious, lovable, and not offensive, but rather interested in whoever it is who's visiting with him. Normally it's a child or a child in company with their parents. And I try to have him be very friendly both to the parents and to the child. Now you can notice that he tilts his head to the left and to the right. He has a double-jointed neck, as I've already illustrated for you. And that adds, in my view, to an interpretation of his character. He is curious about things, so he might cock his head, just as a robin or other bird might, at hearing a strange sound. I've also taken the liberty in this marionette, as I do in most of my marionettes, to give his hand strings only enough length to drop them, as you can see, to this height. His hands are always ready to move. They're not hanging down dead at his side. I can raise one, and possibly the other will drop as a consequence of its strings being slackened. But as I turn him, his hands take part in the movement just because they are natural pendulums, and I think they impart a more lifelike and character descriptive move. He's not just a piece of furniture at this point. He can readily be accepted as a character who has feelings and has ideas and who is reacting. Now, I've begun to animate his hands as I talk, but now I've let go of his hand controls entirely, and it seems to me that his hands are doing something which can contribute to an interpretation rather than simply hanging dead. Now, a special control can do a number of things. It doesn't have to bring a hand to a face. I'm going to show you now another of my characters. This one was designed by my grandfather, Frank B. Rose, probably around 1930. I'll take this marionette away and bring you another one. This is probably the first marionette that I came in contact with on an intimate basis, although my mother claims that I was allowed to cut my teeth on a marionette's leg because they rehearsed in front of my crib, or I occupied the crib in front of their rehearsal. This character is a Yankee farmer. He's intended to represent a resident of Waterford, Connecticut, which is my home, was my home. And this Yankee farmer made his appearance. My father, Rufus Rose, would operate him. He would come into the living room at the request of my grandfather, Frank B. Rose, and together, the two old gentlemen, my grandfather was a lovely Edwardian character, the two gentlemen would visit with one another and talk about such matters as the raising of large families in somewhat difficult economic situation, or they might delve into some philosophical abstraction of one kind or another, of which my grandfather was very fond. He used to quote, my grandfather did, long passages of prose from Alfred North Whitehead and other philosophers. He had committed them to memory. And I've taken one gesture I remember my grandfather using, and I've incorporated that in this character. There is a declamation gesture which was taught, I know, in the public schools at that time, in which putting the hand over the heart was a signal of sincerity. If you wanted to tell the audience that you were truly a patriot, you put your hand over your heart while you swore your oath of allegiance. And that kind of gesture was one I just thought I took the liberty of incorporating here. Well, Frankie, I see you've got 3 more grandchildren this year. Well, you can't stop that, can you? No, that's nature's way. No, that's as it should be. Yeah. Well, I came here today, Frankie, to tell you we may not have many more years together, but that's the way it should be too, I suppose. I won't go further and try to give you a vocal characterization, but that would be something in the nature of the character, suiting to the action to the word and the word to the action. My dad always did this as a live performance without any rehearsal at all, except that he was intimately acquainted, naturally, with his father, and they had a wonderful back-and-forth badinage. I've given him a little hanky, as you can see, in his pocket, which you'll see when he makes his exit. Now I'm going to show you another marionette. This character is really intended to be a self-portrait. I haven't clothed him as I normally would clothe myself, but I've given him a body which is somewhat more normal or natural looking in terms of its proportion or its fullness at the leg and in the arms and in the chest and hips and so forth. I had a mustache when I did this self-portrait, and I don't take it to be a very good one at that. You may notice that this is an old-fashioned, what I would call an old-fashioned airplane control. There's only one string to each hand, and the foot bar must be operated by a second hand. It is not possible to walk him unless you take a second hand and have him do that. All right, now I'm going to take him out and replace him with one more of these individual characters. This marionette here has undergone several transformations. He is, in this present transformation, a caveman, or a prehistoric subhuman, I suppose, or prototype for a human being. I built him, I think, when I was 17 years old in a puppetry institute run by the Puppeteers of America, which I would suggest, if any of you are interested in puppetry, would like to pursue matters of puppetry for your school or for your own private interests, that you contact through your library the Puppeteers of America. He has a special string also here, if I can make his tail work. There it is. And that's just a direct control. There's nothing subtle about that. But he has that double head joint, the neck joint, and he has a 3-point suspension on his 2 ears and on his nose, so he can look up, and if I lift his shoulder strings, he can look down, and he has a kind of a nicely rounded sculptural value to his feet and hands and head. At this time, I was greatly influenced by the late Bill Baird in his style, and I think probably some of his style was a basis of my interpretation for this character. This marionette has been a boxer and a pirate before he became a caveman. I'm going to take him away now and show you some of my other characters off to my right. This lady is intended to represent a professional present-day actress looking for work in the theater, and she's appearing here in rehearsal clothes, and she will attempt to do a tryout. She's going to be, I've intended that she try out for a part in a play by William Shakespeare. She might be a character from a modern television series looking for work again. The other characters I have here, and these I'll just indicate them to you, are William Shakespeare, who's mostly a picture of himself, as you might have recollected from the Droeshout engraving, a character actor, a man of about 70, who's a very mellow fellow, and a Prince Charming, who is a leading man. Those represent some of the potential for characterization in marionettes, as I conceive that process of the design and stringing of marionettes. I've brought out my one and only Pepito to wave a farewell to you. I hope you've enjoyed this and that you will continue your interest in puppetry and specifically in marionettes.